So moving really quite seamlessly from the remarks of the Minister on the importance of human rights, our first panel will focus on that very issue. We have a really remarkably knowledgeable panel of experts. Welcome to you all. Each of you are going to speak for 10 minutes. I will be a strict timekeeper, and then that will hopefully leave plenty of time for active discussion with you, the audience, and within the panel. So without further ado, can I hand over to Park Ji-hyun.
Okay. I have.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, 교수님, and thank you, Minister. Yeah.
I think it probably.
Especially thank you, Minister Kim Jong-un and the ambassador. Yeah, and also our audience. So, there is 10 years ago, is the UN committed investigated human rights place. That's North Korea, where I was born. But 10 years later, today, is still not going on. So, that I was testimonied in COI, and you speak about the women and the children's issues, but that is continued not improved. So that's why 10 years later, we all together in here still talk about the North Korea human rights issues. So today I have two topics. My main point is two. So I am not to speak about the inside North Korea because the prison camp opens outside, not inside. So I want to speak today about North Korean refugees. First, my point is who is escaped North Korea, and many refugees now lives in China. So I know there's many academics and UNs and the South Korea government already speak about that is China repatriation issues, but that is we still not improved these refugees issues. So there's China and North Korea. They made agreement in 1960s and 1986, 1998. Because they mentioned that all North Korean people is illegal across the border and sent back to North Korea. And then in 1997 is Jilin province. They also made another law. Is who helped the North Koreans, they have punished and also fined. That is China law. And in 2001, China made strike hard campaigns. So this one is they search about the North Korean refugees who lives in China and they reported to police after their reward. So that is continued happened. So in this year is April, one of the North Korean defectors escaped the Chinese prison camp, and you see all over the issues how is China made the reward. Its reward prices go up, and many Chinese people looking about the North Korean defectors. And then in 2003, is North and China, they do this extra criminal issues, all North Korean refugees, criminals, and they send back to North Korea. But this is happening now, but we still not improved any issues because all is the government side and the NGOs is looking for that is only political issues. They not think about that is human rights issues. So we already know that is China joined the refugee actions in 1982, but they continued this happened. So in the last 10 years is South Korea government and the unifications and also Seoul UN office, they collected massive information what happened in North Korea too. But we sent to the Kim Jong-un to International Criminal Court, but international law and the international communities to slowly these issues. So we plus here is China also sent to International Criminal Court because it's China. They have got these issues. There's elimination of international racial discriminations because they treatment the North Korean defectors, and also the eliminations of discrimination against women, and the principle of non-refoulement, the Convention Against Torture, and the persecution of a stateless person. That is all is China's criminal issues. So we have to send is Kim Jong-un and the Vox Korea Party and also China's Communist Party to international court. That is, we need international actions. And the section 2 is South Korea challenge. I know that is Article 3 is South Korea constitutions designed the Korean Peninsula and its adjacent island as the territory of the Republic of Korea. It is also recognized the individual born North Korean as potential South Korean citizens. However, we escaped North Korea and arrived in China. We are not, at the moment, we are not recognized as South Koreans. If we are South Koreans, we just going to South Korea embassy or constitutions in China, and then we get the temporary passport and go to the South Korea. That is the main, but nowadays we are not, it's still the problems. So I just is ministers in here and the South Korea government have to make is China with the constitution is all North Koreans is South Korean citizens. We have to make kind of is agreement with China. That is really urgent. We have to save North Korean refugees. Yeah. So that is and also Section 3 is the stateless and the vulnerable people. Because some people could be unfamiliar with statelessness. But before I mentioned that is North Koreans, we are born in North Korea, but we escaped North Korea, and then, we don't know which nationalities, because it's North Korea government told us you are traitors and criminals, and China also said you are illegal, and also South Korea law we are citizen, but it's still not allowed. So we are invisible and also statelessness people. So that is at the moment is EU, is European countries. We continue looking for statelessness issues. But this is 1954, UN already mentioned the Statelessness Act, and 2014 reminded us again. So South Korea government and the Ministry of Unification have to work this together in international community. Statelessness people, and we need temporarily is a document, travel document to North Korean people. Because that is an example is 1990, is World War I is, the Norway activities is Nansen. He already made this Nansen passport. So now is Europe also think about that again, because it's Russia and Ukraine wars. So it's also is the European countries talking about this Nansen passport. So have to think about that. Yeah. Yeah, that is my first point. And my second point is the North Korean culture and the languages. So I know that is a COI report published, and also Ministry of Unification and the ROK government published a lot of report, and also North Koreans defectors published their book. But sometimes these languages, we change it as South washed or Western washed. Because the North and the South Korea, we use the same alphabet and the same language, but North Koreans totally use the different. The reasons that is North Korea, they not allow the personal languages, they only allow the political languages. So people in North Korean people, they use the only political languages. But now is translation, is Korean, North Koreans testimonies, translations could be lots of mistakes, because South Koreans never have kind of this experience. So there is one of my favorite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, who was born in Germany, is a Nazi area. So she mentioned that what reminds victims is language. That is our language is not only communications. It's our life and also Korean history. So we have to the cross-check their testimonies, and we just the real their testimonies is put our document, because that is really important. we are not changing their testimonies. So I hope that is academics and the diplomatics, they have to learn North Korean culture and language, because knowledge is power, and acknowledge is bring to us new is the world, and also that is demanded our history. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for sticking to time so well. I mean, your remarks, I think, remind us that even though we discuss this as an issue that is very regionally concentrated, there is actually a global dimension and a comparative dimension. What you had to say about the importance of recognizing the status of refugees globally, I think is going to be very important in thinking about how we build a community of activity in support of the interests of North Korean refugees. And your final points about language, again, we live in an age where post-truth politics and the manipulation of language is becoming such a source of uncertainty and political tension, not just when it comes to North Korea, but I think globally. So I think it's a reminder of just how common and universal these problems are. So thank you. We'll come back to these themes. Let me now move to Professor Sarah Song, who is both the head of the newly established Korean Centre at the University of Sheffield and, very importantly, the president of the British Association of Korean Studies. So we're very pleased to have you here and looking forward very much to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. And thank you for coming to the UK to have this session as well. It's wonderful to be able to see everybody and to engage in discussion. I'm afraid I am not able to stay for the full day, but I'm glad to be here this morning. So looking back at almost a decade, I suppose, of heightened discourse on the human rights situation in North Korea since the UN Commission of Inquiry reported on North Korea reported in 2014, it is disheartening to see that the situation hasn't changed nearly as much as perhaps we would have liked. Between 2014 and 2019, I was working in Seoul. I was working outside academia. I was working for an NGO conducting research with North Korean refugees and reporting on the situation in North Korea. And because of that, I was able to attend lots of events, a bit like this one, that were held in Seoul, following on from the UN COI, you know, and sort of listening to the views and the expertise of different policy makers, stakeholders, and victims in work on North Korean human rights. I'm acutely aware of the challenge involved in attempting to suggest anything particularly new or creative and constructive, but nevertheless, I think it is important to keep these conversations going. And reflecting back on some of the comments generated in previous years at these sorts of events, I think most of the recommendations made post-COI still stand today. And this was particularly evident to me when I read the report that was recently published by the Ministry of Unification, which outlines the continuation of many of the same conditions that result in widespread human suffering in North Korea. And at the same time, obviously, researchers, including the Ministry of Unification and civil society organisations, are dealing with fewer and fewer up-to-date witness testimonies because so few North Koreans are making it to South Korea at the moment, just a handful really this year as compared to pre-pandemic years. Despite these challenges, some progress has been made in the work of civil society organisations who do persevere tirelessly in their efforts to keep North Korea accountable to its obligations. Towards the end of my time working in Korea in 2019, we published a report through the NGO which looked at how the North Korean human rights movement could better engage with victims of the North Korean regime. And it also discussed how we might be preparing for a future perhaps where human rights abuses in North Korea are a thing of the past. And I think the conclusions of that research do hold quite true now. And I remain convinced that I think many of the most important and interesting insights around the North Korean human rights problem come from civil society organisations, particularly those that engage constructively with North Korean refugees and other victims of North Korean state violence, like the families of abductees to North Korea. So I just wanted to suggest very briefly 3 ways I believe Europe can play a role in supporting approaches that attempt to tackle the issue of North Korean human rights. And I've tried to choose things which I think hopefully other panelists won't overlap with too much today, just for a bit of variety. So the first recommendation I have is around ensuring that NGOs tasked with documenting the situation in North Korea and working with North Korean refugees have access to adequate resources, that they don't face threats to their legal status in South Korea, and that they have access to knowledge and expertise that support their capacity to do their work. We know these NGOs are very valuable. Unlike government bodies, they don't rotate through staff as often. Many leading individuals in the field have expertise that they've gathered over decades of work, and they've been at the forefront of advocacy at the UN and its organs, as well as a range of other international fora like the European Union. The South Korean government's support for civil society work has somewhat wavered between administrations, as we've seen, and also, of course, the ideological divide in South Korea in relation to North Korea has constrained domestic support for civil society work. So NGOs in this context have sought strength and solidarity through the transnationalization of their advocacy, partnering with international organizations, willing to engage in dialogue and also capacity building work with them. But there's always room for more of this in terms of knowledge exchange, including with organizations in the UK and Europe. But North Korean human rights groups based in South Korea do often face operational challenges that can undermine their effectiveness and their ability to engage in that transnationalization work. So resourcing civil society organizations, I think, could better involve funding that helps them diversify away from overdependence on certain single sources of funding, because this can sometimes create a bit of precarity if that funding disappears. And it also, I think, keeps higher skilled workers out of the field, particularly those with technical expertise. But it can also have the impact of creating competition between organizations. And this competition can sap their energy as organizations find themselves facing not just the adversary of North Korea, but adversarial relations between each other. In particular, providing funding that helps cover overhead costs and staff costs can free up time for activists from the constant cycle of very limited term project-specific grant applications and reporting. So at present, less than ideal resourcing has a disproportionate impact, as I said, on highly skilled staff and women joining the field, particularly North Korean refugee women who face considerable barriers to being able to take part in civil society work focused on North Korean human rights. And I'd highly recommend a report written by Connect North Korea, which is a UK-based NGO that provides robust detail on the nature and scale of this impact on North Korean refugee women's participation in this work. I don't really have time to talk much about this aspect, but I think resourcing civil society also involves giving opportunities for forms of training and access to assets like high-quality geospatial imaging or satellite imaging that helps civil society organizations that employ mixed methods approaches to data gathering that complements the more traditional interview work with North Korean refugees, for example. So the second sort of suggestion I have is around facilitating more international knowledge exchange, a bit like what we're doing today between scholars, legal experts, and civil society representatives and also government stakeholders. This summer, I had the opportunity to take a group of 15 students and staff and a North Korean refugee from the UK to South Korea on a study tour funded by the Uni Korea Foundation, or 동일관하는. And we met NGOs, government officials, activists, and went to different sites of memorialization and so on. And we were very fortunate to be accompanied by a North Korean refugee who lives here in Manchester, and who was able to engage with the students and share his perspectives on the meetings we had and the sites we visited. And this experience facilitated a depth of dialogue and consideration of different points of view that was both, I think, quite unique, and also went a long way to helping students and staff advance their understanding of inter-Korean relations and the situation in North Korea. What was also interesting, though, was the South Korean assistants that we had with us, who were students at the University of Sheffield. And some students from South Korea who study on exchange at Sheffield have told me of how their experience of learning about both Koreas from outside the peninsula has sort of given them a renewed interest in inter-Korean relations, particularly seeing British students showing such an interest in their place of origin. And it's also helped them understand the possibilities and challenges of how to approach these problems, perhaps in a new and more constructive way. I know that 1 or 2 civil society organisations in South Korea run programmes with some European funding, I believe, to bring South Korean and North Korean refugee students to Europe to engage in similar forms of experiential learning as that which we did in Korea. They visit The Hague, they go to different sites of memorialisation, archives in relation to Europe's history of war and violence, with the aim of raising a generation of young Koreans with a slightly expanded worldview to engage with North Korean human rights issues and help plan for the future. These programs are quite small and sporadic at the moment, but they could be expanded and regularised to provide consistent training opportunities year on year. In the same vein, Korean studies as a field is growing in popularity across the UK and Europe, and with this comes graduates going into fields including foreign affairs, journalism, IT and business, and they finish their degrees with skills and knowledge that ensures they are well placed to contribute to dialogue and, we hope, progress towards more informed perspectives on North Korea globally. So my final point sort of relates to Ji-hyun's points, and that's about supporting North Korean refugees to engage in work on North Korean human rights. Insulating North Korean refugees and civil society work from the shifting policy approaches of different South Korean governments has been challenging for quite a long time. And for us, on the outside looking in, it's very important that we understand the local and politicised dimension of North Korean refugee lives in South Korea. Most of us here, though, are well aware that North Korean refugees face many challenges as people who've experienced incredibly difficult circumstances. As a result, it sometimes may be tempting to minimise their potential to take leading roles in work on North Korean human rights, or to assume that they'll only do so. I've only got a couple more minutes, 1 more minute maybe. They're able to do so if they possess if North Koreans possess particular forms of social or professional capital, like being able to speak English or having the right degree. But many North Koreans have really defied their circumstances and developed valuable initiatives in support of their community and its needs. And I think it's important that we ensure that North Koreans, both in South Korea, but also here in the UK and Europe, are in a position where they feel secure enough and they have the energy to be able to engage in work in this field on a more equal footing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I can't help but sort of reiterate the importance of those practical measures that you're suggesting, including the importance of funding. But I think it also begs the question where, when it comes to Korea, both understanding South and North Korea, we need to really make a commitment to support our students, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, to ensure that we have the level of expertise that we're going to need in the future. Anyway, talking of language expertise, it's appropriate for me to pass on at this stage to John Everard, who served for 27 years in the Foreign Office, but is also from Cambridge, where he was trained as a linguist in French and German and Chinese. And on that basis, of course, learnt a great deal of Korean. Has published a memoir, Only Beautiful, which I can recommend to you as an insight into what it's like to be an ambassador in the DPRK, and has also served on the UN Security Council panel of experts on North Korea. Headed the panel, is that correct? So I think, John, you're going to speak from here, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So you won't need this mic.
No, there's a microphone there.
Yeah.
Is this microphone on? It is, good. John, many thanks for those warm words of introduction. I endorse everything that's been said by the previous speakers. I offer my thanks to the ambassador, to the minister, for joining us, for making this event possible, and of course to John and his many colleagues for all their help in putting this event together. Good morning, everybody. Just as a kind of opening remark, other speakers have pointed to the Commission of Inquiry, or Inquiry, as the Americans insist on calling it, into human rights in North Korea, which reported 10 years ago next February. It remains the seminal document on the appalling situation in North Korea. Anybody who had indulged the hope that things might have improved in the meantime might benefit from a close read of the presentation to the Security Council on 17 August by Volker Turk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which makes clear that, if anything, the situation has gone backwards. Things are worse now than they were when the Commission of Inquiry published its report. So we're dealing with a set of really very serious problems. Some of the abuses are absolutely sickening, betraying a kind of gratuitous cruelty that is really very difficult to read about without becoming extremely angry. But today I want to talk about what it is specifically that Europe, as opposed to any of the other actors involved, can bring to the table in attempts to improve the lamentable situation of human rights in North Korea. There are 4 points that I want to make about this. Firstly, that although the European embassies are shuttered for the time being, the staff were forced to move out because of COVID, as a general point, Europe has a diplomatic presence in the DPRK, which neither the ROK nor the United States, nor for that matter Japan, do have. This is of vital importance. There are constraints on what diplomats based in Pyongyang can achieve, but there are all kinds of workarounds. And crucially, having people on the ground means that you are not limited to the kind of formal interactions with North Koreans on which many other actors are forced to rely. You can grab North Koreans at cocktail parties. I've had conversations with North Korean officials on the metro. I mean, you strike lucky. You find yourself sitting next to not a minister. They always travel around by limousine. But is that right, Minister? But at least senior officials. And quite often, outside the office, North Koreans will tell you things and also listen to things that they are simply not going to listen to in a formal environment. Is this happy situation going to return? We don't know. I think all the European embassies have been given a kind of offer by Pyongyang to come back, but there's a lot to be sorted out, a lot of cleaning up. I mean, the buildings have been left neglected for a few years. There is just the outside chance that there might be a few microphones stuck in the walls by now, which might be cleaned out. So I don't think anything's going to happen immediately. I nevertheless hope that sooner rather than later, the European embassies can be restaffed and we can reconnect in these different levels with the North Koreans. Second point, that unlike many of the other actors involved, Europe has a track record of engagement on human rights with North Korea. Now, talking to North Koreans about human rights is frankly a bit of an art. And if you look at the records, particularly of the EU-North Korea political dialogue, which sadly got suspended in 2015, but which included human rights interactions, you can see in the early transcripts that the Europeans say things like, we are deeply worried about the state of human rights in your country. And the North Koreans just shut down. And it's not actually a dialogue. They stopped listening. Towards the end of the dialogue, Europeans were getting much better at handling these points. You learn tricks like the phrase human rights is neuralgic in North Korea. You talk to North Koreans about human rights, bang, you've lost them. What you do is say things like, we in Europe, we're deeply concerned to bring our prisons up to international standards and make sure that they are proper institutions designed to restore prisoners to civil life after they've served their sentences. Would you perhaps be interested in doing this research and participating with us? If it's just mechanical stuff like that, which is, come on, prisoners' human rights in North Korea, how much more sensible do you get? The North Koreans will quite often nibble at the biscuit, and you can actually get quite a long way with that kind of approach. Just turn the clock back. There have been periods where you could achieve astonishing things talking to the North Koreans about human rights. You have to pinch yourself to remember that back in the noughties, we actually had a North Korean student studying human rights in the UK. He actually produced a paper on a human rights issue. I forgot what it was now, but it's still out there in the public domain. I think it'll be a while before we get back to that kind of stage, but it has been done and it might be possible in the future. That was my second point. Third point, the Europeans, and particularly the former Eastern Europeans, well, I guess their countries still are in Eastern Europe, they haven't moved, but I mean, obviously politically they've shifted quite a lot, have a depth of experience dealing with North Korea that the United States in particular fundamentally lacks. You have to remember that in the old days of socialist brotherhood, the East Germans, the old Czechoslovakia, Poland Bulgaria maintained a huge embassy in Pyongyang at vast expense. And that you have a lot of the former diplomats from that time who have served multiple tours of duty in Pyongyang. If you were, for example, an East German expert on Korea, that meant North Korea, because of course at the time, East Germany and South Korea had no diplomatic relations. So you had people who bounced around between East Berlin and Pyongyang, 2, 3, 4 postings, with a network of North Korean contacts that is very difficult to match. The other way round, there were intense student exchanges between North Korea and the Eastern European countries. East Germany, the old former Czechoslovakia, Poland, used to deal with dozens of students each year. His Excellency the Ambassador reminded us that the distinguished minister is an alumnus from the University of Virginia, I think you said. It's important to understand that a lot of senior North Koreans have the same relationship with Germany as senior South Koreans do with the United States. It means, for example, that the German embassy in Pyongyang is able from time to time to organise gatherings of alumni of German universities, North Koreans who speak near native German, who studied in Germany, and who got a great deal of affection for the place. It gives you an entree and people who will listen to you and engage with you on difficult things like human rights that the other actors simply don't have. Fourth and finally, because I can see the clock ticking away here. Yes, John's giving me a look. Basic thing. Sorry?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, only 1 minute. One basic point about Europeans. Europeans are not Americans. Now, it's an obvious point, but it is not trivial. If you are American and you start talking to North Koreans, somewhere in the back of the North Korean head, you can see the horns growing out of your head, and you've got a cloven and tail. Americans are just bad. They've been told this since they were children. Europeans are a bit different. You get lots of posters around North Korea, saying, crush the American threat, Americans will never overtake our country. You don't get that with Europeans. North Koreans are prepared to engage with Europeans in a way that they hesitate to with Americans. So 4 points. None of these are a magic key. Talking to North Korea about human rights always is going to be challenging, but I like to think that in some ways they do give Europeans an edge. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John, for reminding us that diplomacy still matters and there's no substitute for being on the ground. I think it's striking to recall, of course, how having that embassy has opened doors in many ways for British actors to raise difficult human rights issues. Lord David Alton, who has been a pioneer in promoting some of those discussions. I remember a few years ago in 2010 brought Chae Tae-bok, the senior North Korean official, to the United Kingdom. Simply having a meeting, though, isn't enough. It's about raising the issues and providing parallel examples. And in this case, the Irish peace process and the example of reconciliation was used, I think, quite cleverly. But Chae seemed to be receptive to having that discussion. But the question, of course, is how do you sustain it over the long term and deliver real meaningful results? We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Now, if we can move, hopefully, if we get our screen up and running, to our next presenter. Benjamin, I hope you can hear me. We may have to shift a little. I will shift so that we can see you. Benjamin Silverstein, in a way, sort of echoes John's points about the importance of having multiple perspectives. You're speaking to us from Jerusalem, I think. Is that correct? And you currently work at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. You took your PhD in the United States. And run a regular blog on North Korean economic issues. So you're well placed to tell us about conditions in the North. I'm not sure whether that's going to be the focal point of your remarks, but I'm going to hand over to you now. I hope you can see most of us, and we're very grateful for you taking the time to be with us virtually. And once again, commiserations for not being able to be with us in person. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much. I'm also very sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. I've been really looking forward to this conference. I've been able to catch some of what the previous speakers have been saying. There's been some issues with the sound, but I really want to thank the organizers, like University and Korean government, everyone, Korean embassy, everyone else involved, especially for making the accommodations to let me participate virtually like this. I really appreciate that. And I also want to say that I think it's not because of where she's from, but I think it's ideally every panel on North Korean human rights or North Korea in general should have someone from North Korea in them. And so I'm very glad that this panel, with the participation of Park Ji-hyun and her very interesting perspectives, is one of those panels. So today, in this presentation, I'm going to be echoing some of the points that Ambassador Everett made. But hopefully there's too much overlap. I wanted to take the opportunity to explore some lessons, particularly from Sweden's relations with North Korea, but also Europe's relations with European states' relations with North Korea in general, with bearing on human rights promotion. And I believe that these lessons tell us something general about the role and potential role of Europe on this issue. So to open up this topic, I want to introduce you to the man on the second to from the right here, Sven-Erik Johansson, who's a Swedish potato farmer from a small rural province in southern Sweden, who spent around 15 years working, going back and forth a lot of the time, but working in North Korea for a Swedish Christian aid organization called PMU Interlife. And as many of you know, conditions for aid workers in North Korea, I mean, when they were even there with the pandemic border closing, most people left, but when aid workers were present in North Korea, conditions were very restricted, severely constrained, with very little freedom of movement, and personal contacts with people in North Korea highly restricted by the government. And here is where I believe that Sven-Erik Johansson says something about this attitude, or this attitude toward Europe that Ambassador Everard mentioned. I believe that Sven-Erik's case says something about this, about how the North Korean government sees Europe. Because unlike most other aid workers, Sven-Erik was able to work on the ground on North Korean farms directly with the grassroots population, mostly in North Pyongan province, in a way that few other people have been able to. And he kept returning to the same farms over long periods of time, enough for him to acquire a basic understanding of Korean language. So I'm bringing up the story of Sven because there is a reason for his special access as an aid worker. Again, the fact that he's from Sweden undoubtedly made stay in North Korea much less contentious than it otherwise might have been. In many ways, Sven embodies the relatively close relations that some European states have with North Korea, and these are countries with which North Korea has tended to be more flexible and permissive in its approach to aid and human rights work than in many other countries. And the DPRK has historically been more open for dialogue with less political sensitivities attached with these countries than with others in the world. And I want to emphasize that I'm not just talking about Sweden, although it happens to be the case I know the best. The United Kingdom, I think, could also be mentioned in this category. Norway, Finland, Switzerland are just a few more examples of countries that North Korea has often regarded as relatively politically benign, enabling them to sometimes push the envelope when it comes to development assistance. And this is something that could potentially let them do so on human rights in general as well. Some few traits shared by these countries to some degree. One is some version of a history of neutrality or not strongly taking sides in international politics, in the Cold War in particular. Some degree of a tradition of large welfare states, and not least, again, which Ambassador Everard mentioned, long-standing diplomatic relations with North Korea. So for Sweden, the existence of a Swedish embassy in Pyongyang since 1973 and a North Korean embassy in Stockholm since 1974 has also been crucial to maintaining relations and keeping this communications channel open through a presence on the ground. These traits give these countries an opportunity, albeit a very limited one, because we are still talking about the DPRK, to engage on development assistance and potential, and also in dialogue on improving human rights. And there is a very recent example that sort of speaks to this relationship, Swedish one in particular. Swedish efforts were reportedly central in assisting in the release of the US soldier Travis King, whose release was negotiated earlier this week. Now, there's some very important caveats to all this. The context is the biggest one. North Korea is perhaps the least willing to engage with Western countries on human rights issues and humanitarian and human needs. It's moved much closer to Russia and China and further away from the West in a very clear and open way. And this, of course, mirrors overall global polarization, which the Excellency Minister Kim spoke earlier, with the rift between China and Russia on the one hand, and the West on the other, growing increasingly large. And only time will tell if, for example, Sweden's upcoming ascension to NATO will complicate its relationship with North Korea. If we imagine a theoretical future where relations between North Korea and these European countries, again, where global conditions for them become favorable and these relations, again, become more active, how can they concretely contribute to positive impacts for human rights in North Korea? Previous speakers had mentioned several great examples. I'm just going to bring up a few others. One is just the simple act of continuing dialogue efforts. Keeping channels open is important in its own right. And the Track 2 exchange efforts and programs that allow North Koreans to spend time in European countries are very important. European countries can also contribute to efforts that the regime is already undertaking and is clearly interested in, like agricultural reforms, by offering expertise and know-how such as that of people like Sven rather than outright aid in crucial areas like agriculture and the environment, and perhaps in particular with issues tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which North Korea has often emphasized outwardly. We could also imagine a scenario where these countries can step up efforts and touch on topics that are more politically sensitive, such as offering capacity building assistance for, say, local governance to help make the system's lower levels more accountable to the grassroots population. After all, local governance is it's probably the level that has the biggest impact on people's everyday lives for the most part. Under the right circumstances, these countries could perhaps support local market administration efforts in North Korea, or assist in constructing a real taxation system, a fair one, a transparent one, again, on the local level. These are other realms that are politically sensitive, potentially, but that matter a lot for people's human rights in the everyday. And all of this, all of what I've mentioned would be in collaboration with the North Korean government. This is itself potentially problematic because the government sets very restrictive rules on what is allowed and who gets the benefits. And it's also in some ways questionable from a moral standpoint. And here I want to echo Sarah's call for making resources available, particularly for NGOs that document North Korean crimes against human rights. But I want to end by emphasizing the comparative advantage that these European states have. What they have done and can do that others cannot do in the same way is to use the confidence and long-standing relations that they enjoy with the DPRK to further human rights in whichever ways possible. So this is an area where Europe can contribute if international conditions allow in a human rights. And I want to thank you all for listening, and wish you all very happy Chuseok. The Jewish holiday of Sukkot also starts today, so we seem to be timing that most years. Anyway, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks for grappling with the technical challenges of speaking through Zoom, and for reminding us of the comparative advantage of the Nordic states and this really critical question, which is what does the North Korean government want? I mean, in terms of change and commitment to reform, because we're all aware of the important work that international organizations can do, but to what extent is Pyongyang actually interested in some of these areas? And again, I'm sure we'll want to come back to that. Let's move on, last but not least, to Dr. Teresa Novotná, who is a visiting professor at the Free University of Berlin, and also based at European, which is a think tank in Prague, and therefore illustrates the importance of thinking about the experience of East European states and states like Germany at the heart of Europe. The Free University of Berlin, I think many of us will know, has done an enormous amount of work on Korean-related issues. There was a recent conference organized by the Sejong Institute at the Free University, which has done, I think, a great deal of work in trying to look hard at these practical questions. So we're very much looking forward to your remarks, Teresa. Let me pass the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, Minister. In your honor, I put on the unification colors. But actually, after that, I heard that you are Boston University alumnus. Me too, with my PhD. So had I known that, I would have put on Boston Terriers on next time. In any case, I would like to also thank to the Ministry and to Cambridge University for inviting me. I remember I participated in one Korea Global Forum in 2015, so that's already 8 years ago in Brussels. And of course, the global context looks quite different to 2015. Not only that, we had a worldwide pandemic, which for North Korea meant really a safe self-isolation, much more than any sanctions would have achieved. But also, of course, Europeans are now facing the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which also means that we see other conflicts or other issues, including Korean Peninsula through slightly different lens. And of course, we have the global tensions between US, China, and the rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow, within which North Korea is quite adept at navigating in. So where does it leave us with human rights and particularly Europe and its role on these issues? So I will look at especially the EU level, also because John reminded the anniversary of the UK Korea relations, but this year is also 60 years of the EU Korea relations, diplomatic relations. So I will leave aside more the international UN level and the NGO level that we have heard. So the engagement with the DPRK started around 2001, including on human rights, when at that time High Representative Javier Solana, Swedish Prime Minister, Graham Person, and Commissioner for External Affairs Chris Patten visited Pyongyang in May at that time. And actually, as a result of that, there was not just the political dialogue, but also the human rights dialogue. But as we've already heard, both of these dialogues were suspended. The human rights dialogue, basically at the moment when the EU started co-sponsoring the Human Rights Council resolutions on the situation of the human rights. There have been few attempts to restart this. There was a visit in 2014 by Kang Suk-ju, the North Korea's Workers' Party International Affairs Secretary, so sort of like a party's Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he visited Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. And there was an attempt to restart this, but it didn't happen. And there were a few recent attempts. But actually, the most recent one was rather due to the European Union, which didn't want to kind of engage at this level with North Korea. So this is sort of the political engagement, or let's say the engagement from the side of the EU institutions, or foreign policy institutions, to put it differently. Then we also have within the EU hierarchy, European Parliament. In the European Parliament, there's quite an active delegation for the Korean Peninsula, which has been pursuing different levels of engagement, including on human rights, including visits to DPRK, but that hasn't happened since some time ago. And also European Parliament as a whole has been involved in human rights issues in North Korea. The last moment, I would say, is the EP's resolution from April 2022, which was specific resolution about human rights situation in North Korea, including persecution of religious minorities. I would say that this resolution was kind of a hodgepodge of different things. I've appreciated in that resolution, for instance, what Ji-hyun was mentioning, support for the North Korean refugees, and the fact that, for instance, China treats them differently. So there was an encouragement towards the Chinese government to treat North Korean refugees differently. There was also a reference to sort of internal closing of North Korea due to the COVID situation, or let's say the use of the COVID situation for internal suppression of more freedoms. But then there were also issues related to the religious issues, and there I had a bit of doubts that actually these were based on proper research and proper really the veracity of the research which was behind it. Nevertheless, it shows that the European Parliament is also engaged in different ways through the delegation, but also through European Parliament's resolution. So, in a way, we have different levels of European engagement, EU as such, not just member state, from the political dialogues to the resolutions, but we also have sanctions. And that's not just the EU sanctions or transposition of the UN sanctions, but there is since 2021, so since 22nd March 2021, a special global human rights sanction regime, so sort of European version of the Magnitsky Act, which was released in March 2021, and at that time the sanctions targeted several countries, DPRK, China, Russia, Libya, South Sudan, and Eritrea. And within the North Korean section, it was targeted at mostly officials who are responsible for the prison camps and also Ministry of State Security. It's interesting to sort of compare the reaction by the Chinese side and the DPRK side to this. The Chinese side at that time, because the Chinese officials which were targeted were mainly those engaged in violations of human rights in Xinjiang. And it basically, China reacted by sanctioning members of the European Parliament, various other institutions at the EU level, think tanks and so on. And European Parliament then suspended a ratification process of the investment treaty between the EU and China. But if you look at how DPRK at the time reacted, I would say very eloquently. There was a statement by the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs calling the sanction regime a farce. To cite, EU needs to bear in mind that if it persistently clings to the futile anti-DPRK human rights smear campaign in disregard of our repeated warnings, it will inevitably be faced with unimaginable and miserable consequences. So, you know, you see the language. But in effect, especially in contrast to the Chinese reaction, that was it. So only this statement by the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was the outcome. Why I'm emphasizing that? Well, I think it goes back to what John was saying. Despite this rhetoric, I think there is still very much scope for engagement from the European side, because even at the moment when the EU sanctions DPRK officials for human rights violations, in a way, the North Korean reaction is just a statement. So I would sort of echo what John and actually Ben was saying. I think Europeans have really a good opportunity to make the most out of hopefully reopening of the borders and hopefully going back to the DPRK. I would encourage the EU to reopen at least one of the two dialogues, either the political one that John mentioned, or you can even try to reopen the human rights dialogue. And perhaps think creatively, don't start with rhetoric about human rights, but maybe start with issues like social rights, economic rights, and so on, and kind of work from that level up. And just to finish on sort of the global aspect, of course now there is lots of fear that there is a sort of axis of evil being built between Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow. And the EU has also said if there is any a missile transfer between Russia and North Korea, there will probably be new sanctions from the European side. But nevertheless, we should also think that even the Putin-Kim summit was probably also a signal to China that the two leaders have, other options, not just dependence on China. And so we should try to think about this whole perspective also from this angle, and not just to sort of go back to self-fulfilling prophecy of putting all the three countries into one basket, and think creatively where we can engage and insert back in the issue of the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for reminding us of the importance of the history of European relations with North Korea and the institutional and Commission and parliamentary level contacts. I think it's important to remember that it's not just individual countries. That takes us to the Q&A session. We have about half an hour. So I propose to just open the floor, and we have just this one microphone, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask people in the audience to speak loudly. When you ask your question, if you can sort of identify who you are and if you represent an institution. I suspect most of you will be from Cambridge, but there may be others here. It would be helpful for us. So who would like to ask the first question?
I would like to.
Yeah, Jim? Okay.
Jim Hall.
Oh, we do have another mic. Excellent. Okay, wonderful.
I don't like microphones. Is it on?
Yeah, it's for the recording.
Okay. I'm not sure about that. This is more a comment.
Jim, can you tell us who you are? Because
I'm
a lot
sorry.
of us don't know.
I'm sorry, yes.
May not know.
I'm Jim Hoare. I'm down from SOAS. My relationship with SOAS is a somewhat tenuous one. I was, like John, a British diplomat. I opened the British Embassy in Pyongyang 22 years ago. And I was there until the end of 2002. I've been back many times since. My comments are really a bit diffuse, but I'm always worried about the introduction of more sanctions. North Korea has been under sanctions since July 1950. Some of those sanctions are still in place. So that's been very successful, hasn't it? Just piling on sanctions for new things, often with the same people being involved, gets you nowhere. Somehow you've got to get away from on human rights and on other issues as well. You've got to get away from the past. The one time I think we ever made an impression on the North Koreans in the British Foreign Office, before we had diplomatic relations, we used to have political talks between the European Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the DPRK and the British Foreign Office. And the one time, often there was criticism of human rights issues. The one time we actually got through to them, and there was a response, a positive response, was we didn't talk about North Korean human rights problems. We talked about British human rights problems. And for them, it was a bit of an eye-opener. Here was the one part of the British government criticising other parts of the British government for failures over human rights issues. Brutality amongst the police, brutality in prisons, even some of our past record. I mean, for a long time, we wouldn't sign a lot of the UN conventions because of what we were doing in Northern Ireland. Now, that actually did arouse a sort of interest in the North Koreans, which I'd never seen before. And I took part in some of the dialogues, at the early human rights dialogues at the beginning of this century, where we each side talked, but each side talked past each other. So I would put to the panel, can you get away somehow from this sterile, you're bad, we're good, to something more positive? Thank you.
Who would like to take that first easy question? John.
Do you, microphone? I think this might be an historic first. I actually agree with quite a lot of what Jim has just said.
I agree with what you were saying when I came in.
Good heavens, the revolution's upon us. For those who don't know this dialogue, Jim and I, former colleagues, disagree on virtually everything to disagree on. So this is an historic day. But to come to your point, Jim, yes, I was trying to indicate in my talk that if you simply wag your finger at the North Korean to say your human rights are terrible, they need to change, you will get absolutely nowhere. They'll close down, they'll become angry, they'll become resentful. You take a different approach. Jim pointed out that on occasions we've admitted that we too in the UK have human rights problems. Or you simply take the whole human rights thing apart into individual bits and you talk about prison reform. running courses in modern journalism. I think was floating around the North Koreans at one stage, and they nibbled, but I don't think they actually went ahead. Jim's nodding. He remembers this.
A couple come to Britain, but they thought there was far too much news on the television, for example.
Okay, there's the answer to that one. I think it's regrettable that where the EU political dialogue, at least the human rights sections with the DPRK, talk about carrots and sticks, there's not many carrots in there. I mean, and for the first time in, correct me if I'm wrong, March 2021, the EU actually sanctioned a range of North Korean officials for human rights abuses. I mean, I understand the emotion behind this, and I understand what they're trying to achieve, but I'm pretty sure that this will get us absolutely nowhere. Thanks.
Anybody else would like to comment on the panel? Sarah or Jeevan?
Tomorrow is 85 years. It's Munich Agreement in 1938. Nazi and Chamberlain. It's a peace agreement, but after it's Nazi started World War II, and they killed Jewish people, and also 1980s, Margaret Thatcher made another agreement with Chinese President Deng Xiaoping. Is Hong Kong is joined in China, but after all, that is communism countries never heard, and they never improved our human rights issues. So I know that is UK and the EU all over the world, United Nations, they made kind of sanctions and improved the human rights issues, but we now need kind of Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan is leaders we need nowadays. Because in 2023, our leaders lack of knowledge about the communism countries, especially the totalitarian country in North Korea. Because in North Korea, they have got, it's not Marxism or Lenin is the ideology. They have got Kim Il-sung ideology. That is a totally different ideology. It's a Juche ideology, and also they have 10 principles. So they control the people about these 10 principles. So North Korea joined this UNUPR is 2009, 2014, and 2020, but they continued rejected about the main point is not change the classifications with Songbun systems, and also they not change the punish the North Korean refugees who repatriated to North Korea because they are all criminal people. So it's a world view. They think about the communism countries, they think about the human rights, same as our mind, but they are totally different mind is human rights issues. I think that's why education is really important, because it's all academics, Western academics, talk about the East Germany unifications and also East socialism countries collapsed down. But Korean Peninsula is totally different. Korean issues is totally different. So I need our strong leader coming from in South Korea government. Because it's UK, we are got different parties, conservative, Labour, and all over the party, but they are only one voice, human rights issues. They continue to speak about the Hong Kong issues. I really envy. But in South Korea, they divided this, the opposite parties. Yeah.
Sarah, would you like to say anything on this issue? You don't have to, but...
Yeah, a few thoughts going on, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, just I suppose to echo what's being said, the importance of leadership and consistency. I mean, it was only, 2 days ago that our Home Secretary gave a very contentious speech, which, the importance of maintaining the integrity of international institutions that are at the forefront of protecting refugees and rights of migration means that our leaders have to be very careful in making sure that they are consistent and don't threaten the institutions that we value so much. And of course, what we're seeing at the moment is, a very vital debate within our societies about how we protect democratic values. Maybe that's an opportunity, though. It's not a zero-sum choice, is it, surely, that we can do that at home while at the same time pointing out the flaws of countries abroad. Teresa, would you like to comment on this question? If not, we can take other questions from the floor. Okay. More questions from the floor. There must be more, I'm sure. Don't be shy.
It's rather difficult for Britain to be suddenly sanctimonious about North Korea or anywhere else, given the attitude of the present government towards human rights issues, which you just touched upon. I thought that speech was appalling.
Although it's worth noting that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary don't appear to agree on this issue. So there is this will probably be analysed by political observers for some time to come. Can I invite more questions from the audience?
Maybe I'll just have one small remark also, because I was quite happy that John raised the countries of former Soviet bloc, and I'm myself Czech, so I'm always very happy if it's not me but someone else who took who raises our importance, let's say. But actually, what I wanted to say, there was a visit. I think it was probably 2018-19. By at that time the Speaker of the Czech House, and who was also former foreign minister. It was probably the last highest level visit to Pyongyang. And he actually did raise human rights as one of the issues he was talking there at the time. And I remember, asking him, what was the reaction? And he said, they said, well, that's always the issue that we have with the Europeans. But it wasn't a contentious problem in at least raising that as an aspect. Unfortunately, he was then photographed in a museum next to North Korean machine gun. So all the Czech media paid attention to this rather than actually, to the content of the visit. But nevertheless, I think that was a good moment.
Okay. Benjamin, I realise that we're in danger of neglecting you behind us. Did you have any thoughts?
I don't feel neglected.
Okay.
So far during the Q&A, I think what I would have said has been very nicely covered by others.
Okay. Let me come, if I may, back to Sarah on this question of the role of NGOs and how do you, we have so many different organisations at the moment which are involved, from Britain, from Europe, from South Korea. From your experience, how well integrated are their efforts? Is there a lot of duplication? Is there a lot of sharing of information? It's often, I think, something that I've noticed that we almost need, if you like, an audit of what we know and what we don't know about the DPRK, because we have this accumulation of experience, but it seems to me one of the critical challenges is actually testing that knowledge and cross-checking. So I don't know if you can say a few words about the role of different NGOs and how this information is shared.
I have been away for about 4 years now from working directly with the NGOs, although I did meet some of them in July recently. But there is cooperation between them, and it's gotten a lot better, particularly since the UN Commission of Inquiry, in terms of the way they have been encouraged to cooperate with one another, not just as a result of the Commission of Inquiry, but also at the request of their funders in many ways. But there is still a need, I think, for each one to have a USP, as it were. And this is one of the issues, perhaps, of that is connected to funding as well. They need to find projects, they need to have ideas, they need to innovate in ways which, I guess, satisfy their business plan, I suppose. They need to be able to function, so they need to identify themselves as having either unique knowledge or a unique focus or a particular direction in the way that they use the knowledge that they have. And so it's quite a taxing job to do that. And that does mean that they can be resistant to cooperation with one another. In certain, there are some who are established more earlier and who may feel as though newer organisations coming in are sort of just duplicating that work. Whereas a newer organisation might say, oh, well, no, we're actually going to use it for this purpose, or when are we focusing on this particular issue, these types of violations. I think the United Nations Seoul Office has done some helpful work in trying to get organisations to pool their knowledge and their expertise and also their data. The data is a really tricky one because of its sensitivity, and so finding secure repositories for data is very challenging. Some NGOs have typically been quite lax in the protection of their data, and that's potentially hugely risky for the suppliers of that data and anyone they may be connected to. I mean, even the South Korean government has had its own data repositories hacked by malicious sources in the past. It's very, very difficult to ensure its security, and so that's another issue which makes organisations often reluctant to share data. But in terms of sort of what you say about an audit or finding a way to sort of get an overview of what's been going on, I think some organisations, through particularly the larger organisations, have worked to do that themselves in a way, in that they've found areas where they can cooperate very effectively to make their information useful at major international fora. But there are always challenges, and that's often down to how skilled they are at networking internationally. Some are much more skilled at it than others. Some just have the networks and some don't, and it's a lot more difficult for them. So there's lots of different kind of issues within that community. I think they're getting better, but I think many of them could do well to just be more open to dialogue with one another and to work cooperatively rather than kind of sometimes being a bit at loggerheads with one another.
Okay. John, I think you had a point.
Yes, I just, as a kind of afterthought to some of the things that Jim was saying, sanctions on the DPRK, and I'm talking here specifically about sanctions associated with human rights abuses. And full disclosure, I used to sort of effectively run the sanctions regime against the DPRK, so I've got skin in the fight here. But sanctions, a good sanction has to be, one, targeted. You have to know and you have to explain why it is that you are sanctioning that particular person, entity, whatever, and what they have done that is bringing that sanction on their head. Two, escapable. There's no point sanctioning somebody or a country if you don't explain what it is they have to do to have that sanction released. You need to provide an off-road. You are trying to change behaviour. Thirdly, crucially, a sanction has to be enforceable. There's no point just passing sanctions for the sake of sanctions. You devalue the currency. Unless you're actually going to do something about that sanction, don't put it in. And the March 2021 EU sanctions on DPRK officials fail all those tests. They would, if they had been put to the UN Security Council for approval, they wouldn't have passed the giggle test, to be honest. One of the classics is the EU has sanctioned one of the chief prosecutors of the DPRK for his involvement in prosecuting political offenders. Where's his off-ramp? What's he supposed to do? Stop prosecuting? It's kind of what prosecutors do for a living. Moreover, the people involved, they all have now EU travel bans. What's the point of that? These people never leave the DPRK in any case. They have asset bans. These people don't have assets abroad. No, this is the politics of symbolism at its lowest form. And very sadly, I have to say that a lot of the bilateral US sanctions, just within the tradecraft, are also lamentably deficient. Sanctions need to be part of a wider mix, as Jim has quite rightly pointed out, but in their own terms. They have to be properly constructed sanctions, and these aren't.
Okay, we have two questions over here.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation this morning. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and particularly to the speakers for what they've said. So I've worked on peace building around the world over a number of years. I've also had a broader research interest over, for example, how you define human rights, what constitutes a human right. And of course, in our Western societies, these are extremely individualistic in their conception. We are autonomous individuals. It's the right of the individual, and it's not put in the context of the relationship or the obligation of the other party or anything like that. And also, of course, we're talking here particularly about how states abuse individuals, which doesn't have the same relational resonance as when you put rights and obligations into the broader social context. However, I am concerned that that perhaps we in the West get too quickly on our high horses on this in pointing the finger at DPRK and if I may say so, I'm condemning my own country here in particular, but perhaps the same is true to some extent in South Korea as well. Because if you take another aspect of what it constitutes to be a human being, which is the fundamental importance of people having relationships with other people, and you start looking at levels of, let's say, loneliness in different societies, then we come out with a very different set of answers to the kind of answers you get if you take the human rights agenda as currently defined in the West. So rights, I think, need to be put in a relational context, and we need to rethink what constitutes an abuse of human rights. And then you start analyzing countries on a very different basis indeed. I mean, if you look at the US, with the amount of loneliness there is, for example, among old people, how so many people in old people's homes in the US never get a visit from anybody at any time. Is that an abuse of human rights? No, it's not on the human rights agenda. We don't think the US abuses human rights in that way. Well, actually, from a relational point of view, they definitely do. It depends on whether you think of human beings in autonomous terms or relational terms. And the same would be true if you looked at South Korea, I'm afraid. So if you do a deep dive into what's going on in North Korea and South Korea, for example, on areas like healthcare, education, and across a wide range of sectors, you do come up with a very different perspective than if you simply focus in on autonomous, Western-defined human rights. I just think we need to draw back a little bit from how we've defined these terms and re-examine them, assuming not now this autonomous Western individual concept, but a much more relationship-based context, which is much more true to the cultures of both North and South Korea. But I could go on a long time, John, but that's a starter.
Michael, can you tell the audience who you are?
Yes, my name's Michael Schluter. I'm sort of retired economist. I used to work with the World Bank, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and so on. But I've also done a lot of research on peace building in South Africa. I worked on the end of the apartheid regime at a very high level. And also I've worked in Rwanda after the genocide. I've worked in North and South Sudan. And I got drawn into the North-South Korea issue about 7 or 8 years ago. I've written quite a large book on a practical path to reunification of the peninsula, which looks across all the different sectors of public life in North and South Korea. So that's a brief.
Okay, who on the panel would like to comment on Michael's observation, if anyone?
Thank you for your question, Mike. For me, it's a former North Korean, arrived in the UK. So until the 2012, I didn't understand the Universal Declaration, human rights, international law, and the individuals, and also personal emotions. What means personal emotions? But in 2014, I met Eun-jung, and we wrote the book together. Because before many Western journalists asked me write a book with me, something that, but I just denied it. The reason that is my activities work, I just around the world, especially in Germany, and many people mention that is the Korean Peninsula is example is Germany unifications. So first time I believed that, but when I started my activities work, that is totally different. Germany unification and the Korean Peninsula. Yeah. So that's why I met Eun-jung and we worked 5 years. So it's for me, North Koreans, we have got the same language, but totally different culture. Because I am human, but in North Korea, dictators destroyed our thinking because we are only modern slavery. So we only talked about that's only politics side. So our emotion also politics. So when I met Eun-jung, it was really difficult because she asked me, it's general personal questions, but I didn't say. How did I say? I had a happiness moment in my country with my family or grandmothers, my friends. It's the first time was really difficult because we never opened our emotions in outside. But all over the world, especially South Koreans, still don't understand these cultures. So that's why still the kind of discriminations inside South Korea. Yeah, so they just is divided in South Koreans and North Koreans is at the moment. So we have to improve these issues, understand. So that is to be educations. We have the educations, but in the UK, there is high schools still teaching the Korean War, but in South Korea, education is still lack. So it's in April, that South Korea parliament visited the UK. I asked to them, it's about the educations, but they not answer to me. Yeah, it's difficult because it's South Korea they divided politics. It's parliamentaries. One is the pro-North Korea. One is nowadays is government is continued fight is North Korea regime, and they wanted to improve the human rights issues. But every 5 years, changes these situations. So that could be different. So we have to telling that it's natural is North Koreans' emotion, cultures, and languages in South Korea and also Western countries. We are not. It is changed our languages before I mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay, Teresa.
Yes, maybe a bit more of a comment on what you were saying about also the unification and how the feelings of North Koreans are nowadays in South Korea as well. I actually came to the research about the Korean Peninsula through my work on how countries or continents could be unified. So I was looking at unification of Germany and Czech accession and other Central Eastern European countries to the European Union, sort of looking at how you can unify in both cases. And actually my conclusion was, well, you shouldn't do it the way how the Germans did it, mainly because of how the Easterners always felt about the unification. So how the East Germans feel about the unification process and how the Czechs and Slovaks and others feel about the accession to the European Union, or what we used to call it, return to Europe. And one of the reasons why it was exactly that in the East German case, let's say lots of the demands at that time were not, taken seriously, and therefore there is still resentment, or Germans call it the wall inside of the heads, between the East and West. Of course, with the time, this is diminishing because the country is unified for so long, so the younger generations obviously feel quite differently. But if you still talk to the older people who still experience the division in Germany and in Europe, the perception is quite different. So maybe if you look at the different models how to unify, try not to copy the German one. That would be my recommendation.
Let me see if there are more questions. Yes, right in the middle. Yeah, and there is a mic moving around somewhere so that we can record what you have to say. And again, if you can tell us who you are, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very enriching comments by all the panel members. I am Choi Eun-jung. I also go by my pen name, Choi Se-rin. I wrote a book together with Park Ji-hyun, and I just wanted to share a couple of comments about how I, as a South Korean living abroad, had to sort of change my identity from being a South Korean to being a Korean, period. And that was very, very difficult to do. As Ji-hyun said, it took me 5 years to write this book with her. If maybe I can contribute a little bit to the theme of the conference today, which is how can Europe help promote North Korean human rights issues. Maybe I could suggest that we could think a bit creatively out of the box and maybe include some softer subjects like literature into this matter. Because at the end of the day, Jian and I were human beings. We're human. And when we talk to a university in Europe, for instance, in October and November, there's a talk scheduled, University of Paris, University of Prague, in the Republic of Czech, University of Slovakia, University of Vienna, and we go together in front of the students, her and I, standing next to each other, and we show to the audience that we are just human beings, and we can be together and we can have the same speech. So the message, I guess, would be, if we talk about human rights, nuclear issues, UN Commission, it all sounds very, very hard, a difficult topic to approach from a civilian standpoint. And we tend to think, oh, these are for the government people to deal with. But it relates to all of us if we bring it down to a human level by evoking, how we grew up and how we differ and how we got to speak to each other together, despite the fact we were from enemy countries. And a lot of Eastern European countries relate to this story because they had a communist history that they share with us and so forth. So, when you bang at a door and it doesn't open, then let's bang on the other one and try to think of other ways of tackling the issue instead of going in one direction only. I am sure it is very enriching for everybody to look at this issue from different standpoint, whether it's academic, political, or liberal arts angle. So that's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Okay. Who would like to explore that topic? The question of literature, humanities, does this offer a new opportunity for work with North Korea? Okay, John, you're shaking your head. Tell us why.
I fully understand where you're coming from, and I'd love to be able to agree with you. But given the extent of the control that the North Koreans exercise over the material that people are allowed to read, I think it'll be a long time before we get anywhere down that track. I mean, North Korean friends used to have sort of kind of carefully secreted family treasures, North Korean or just Korean novels from the 1950s. Occasionally I saw these things. They'd clearly been read sort of, hundreds and hundreds of times, dog-eared, very tattered, and then sort of put in a dark place so that if your flat was ever swept by the security services, they would never find these things. But getting new material in, work through the arts, work through the wider humanities, the North Korean regime understands very well what might be achieved from our point of view through that, and they will die in the last ditch before it happens.
I know there's another question here. John Dunn, can we just get a mic over here, please?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to...
Again, John, can you tell us who you are?
Sorry,
I know who you are.
I'm John Dunn. I'm an expired professor of political theory. I find it
far from expired. Far from expired.
I find it very difficult indeed to see what sort of incentives in principle it could be possible for a British diplomat to or a British political leader, actually, to give to the current DPRK regime to improve its approach to human rights. But it doesn't seem quite so desperate, or anyways, there's been times recently when it hasn't seemed so desperate to think of the possibility of such a person making a proposal to the government of the PRC that they might actually treat North Korean refugees in a less barbarous manner. Is it possible that I mean, there have been times, after all, when the British government has been very eager indeed to cooperate with the government of the PRC. is there potentially room there, not perhaps at this very instant, but in principle, a more promising approach?
And maybe it's worth adding to that observation that, of course, South Korea has, through its own trilateral mechanism with China and Japan, and because of its own proximity to China, in theory, an opportunity, but maybe that's naive. But who would like to comment? Yeah.
Yes, I indulge the hope that some of what you've just said is changing anyway. We, just over the last few weeks, we've watched Kim Jong-un disappear off to Russia and come up with a quite extraordinary remark that from here on, North Korea's principal foreign policy objective is to develop relations with Russia, which is poking China in the eye, which is, in general, don't do this. It's not a clever thing to do. And now we have talk of Xi Jinping visiting South Korea. If the Chinese start to go just a little bit chilly on North Korea, I mean, this will be carefully graduated, I suspect that their treatment of North Korean defectors in China might well be one of the first things to change. Could I have another minute?
Yes.
Briefly, okay. Look, and I see Ivan is standing there with a gong. I suspect that we're about to disappear off. But just to end what I say on a more hopeful note, when we talk about human rights abuses in North Korea, it's important to understand why the North Korean regime behaves the way it does. It's almost entirely fear. They are afraid that if they let dissidents run around North Korean society, they will be undermined. They've got real problems with cadre loyalty as it is. They are afraid that if they let Western ideas into their society, that the Juche idea is going to be swept away, and what it might be. The whole thing is based on fear, and they are more afraid of some aspects of change than others. So, I think it will be a long time before we see a real openness to new ideas coming into North Korea. I think it will be a long time before we see the North Korean regime tolerate freedom of assembly. They're afraid of riots. They're afraid of mobs. Mobs and riots happen in North Korea. Remember 2009, where the North Korean regime was forced by public uprising almost to reinstate the markets. They felt they had to shoot a prime minister. Being a prime minister in North Korea is a high-risk occupation. They're afraid of that. They are much less afraid of other things. Religious freedoms. The churches in Pyongyang are partly fake, partly real, I believe. I believe this because one of my friends in Pyongyang was a devout Italian Catholic who went to the Catholic cathedral in Pyongyang, remember this one, every Sunday and talked to as many people as she could. And she came out with the conclusion that there were definitely government stooges in there, but that some of the people there were genuine Catholics. They couldn't celebrate Mass because they didn't have a priest, but they could at least go through a Catholic service. Provided the North Korean regime can watch what goes on inside churches, they will probably be open to allowing some degree of religious freedom. They're concentrating on
that point.
Go on, then.
Did you know that the Vatican, certainly up when I was in Pyongyang, would regularly send emissaries from the Vatican, Monsignore, fairly high rank in the church, to North Korea to keep in touch with the North Korean Catholic Church, just in case they were genuine Catholics.
A very good point. Thank you for pointing that out, Jim. Also, the concentration camps. I'm not suggesting that North Korea is about to close these horrible, horrible institutions down, if only. But there is low-hanging fruit. I suspect that with careful cultivation and reasoned debate over a long period of time, they could be induced to at least changing the three-generation rule, so that you only send to the labour camp the person who's done something that you find objectionable, not his or her parents and children also. I mean, this doesn't take us to anything like an acceptable state, but that would be, for example, a major step forward. I'll shut up, thank you.
Okay, last word, I think. Well, do you both want to talk?
No, I'm all right.
It's because we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Benjamin?
I just wanted to make a very quick one.
Okay, all right.
Yes. Just to add on to the last comment about concentration camps, like I think what, the North Korean regime, according to what we can see on satellite imageries that have reduced the size of the camp system as such over the past few years, and very likely partially because of the attention that's been directed toward the camp system by the UN Commission of Inquiry. There are other examples of this that we know from high-ranking defector memoirs, sources like that of the North Korean government actually being caring about its international reputation enough to take certain measures like that, at least downsizing the camp. So there's just want to just throw that data point in there.
Thank you, Benjamin. Last word to you.
Yeah. United Kingdom is a UN Security Permanent Member, and this year South Korea also joined non-permanent members. So I come from North Korea originally, so I wanna telling the South Korea government is the next year is the COI came from 10 years is a report. So this is COI report, and the last 10 years, academics, all medias, we continue to speak about all those much. Is the people died of starvations. But I want to change this world. This is not all those much. That is a genocide. It's happening in North Korea. It's there is in nowadays many 2014 is China is Uyghur is the genocide, and Cambodia is all of the mentioned to be genocide, but North Korea still is a crime against humanity. I know it's many international law mentioned it to me. It's similar names, but that is not similar names. It's a genocide. And also, I hope the South Korea government next 3 years is a cultural genocide happening in North Korea. Before Jim mentioned that is Pyongyang is Catholic religions, but I really angry to that is many experts and diplomatics, they only look for in Pyongyang. Because North Korean people, we live in another province. They all forget these people. So in North Korea, we have got two different, inside we have got two different Pyongyang citizens and original North Koreans. But last 10 years, all over the world, never mentioned these original people. They only work in Pyongyang, and then they publish it. North Korea has changed a lot of that. That is, I'm just really angry about that. So I hope next 3 years is South Korea is joined non-permanent members have to work with original people, because Sherry mentioned that we are human beings, and we are not numbers.
That's a sober point to end on, but let me use that as a basis for us to reflect and to thank the panel for their observations. I'm not going to try and sum up what has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you all for your observations. We will come back here at 1:25 to commence our next session. But in the meantime, can I ask you to thank the panel